Hey everyone, today I'm going to talk to you about my harmonic balancer and why I have what I have, how I got it, who made it, and how I installed it. So here we go. So if you're going to run under NHRA safety rules, you have to have an SFI 18.1 rated harmonic balancer anytime you go 1099 or quicker in the quarter mile. And when I first got this damper, I didn't do that. The car was still stock, but I knew, or at least the plan was to put a turbo on it back at that point. So I needed to have a balancer made that would work when I got fast enough. And nobody makes an SFI approved balancer for a Mercedes, at least an NA Mercedes. I think Innovators West makes ones for the M113k. But at the time, this was an NA motor, so that wasn't going to work. So I reached out to ATI and told them what I had, and they said, well, ship me your stock one and we'll take a look at it. And they'll build custom stuff, and if they have to engineer it, they'll charge you an engineering fee, and then they'll charge you to actually build it. So I sent my damper in, and as luck would have it, they had the engineering done already for a 6.2 liter AMG. I assume that's probably the M156 engine. I'm not really sure, but the dimensions, or at least the important dimensions, were all the same. So I did not have to pay for the engineering work. I just had to pay to have one built. And as you can see from their drawing here, if you want this, reference drawing number SK260G1 when you call them. It's an overdriven compared to stock, because this is the smallest diameter they can make the SuperDamper. But it works out as long as you get a smaller water pump pulley. Otherwise, it won't work without that. So I got this from VRP, but I think there's a couple other places that make smaller water pump pulleys to clear bigger balancers. And so what you get is the balancer itself, which is SFI rated, which has the sticker right there, so I'm good for NHRA rules. And they'll send you, it's a two-piece deal. You get the hub, and then you get the balancer separately, which mounts on to there like that. So this is what I was going to run when I was going to run turbo, and I ran this on my NA motor for, I don't know, a year or two. And then I had a change of plans when I blew that engine up, and I just put a stock supercharged M113k in it. And so at that point, I needed something that would drive the supercharger. So I called them back, and this time they did have to make the drawing for me. I don't think this existed before I called them, but this is the drawing for just the crank pulley that bolts on to the damper. So if you want one of these, reference SK260G6. And what this is a 185 millimeter 8-rib pulley that bolts onto the front of the balancer using the same 3 bolts that go into the hub. And with this setup, you've got the same dimensions as you have with a stock Mercedes pulley. It's just 185 millimeter. And again, that's the smallest they can make it with the SuperDamper. And for this setup, you definitely need a small water pump pulley, because it rides behind here. You can see that where it's actually rubbing a little bit. I had to have it put on a lathe and clearanced a few thou, because it will rub if you don't. But now I have a fully rebuildable SFI approved balancer that's not going to fly off at 140 miles an hour down the big end of the track. So that's good. Now let me talk a little bit about how I pinned this hub onto the crank, because if you know the Mercedes snouts, they do have a keyway, but it's a little one, and they're notorious for shearing that key off. And so it's a really good idea to pin it with a second pin, which is what I've done here. That's where the second pin goes. Let me show you the jig that I had made to be able to do that. The whole goal of pinning the crank is to give yourself a second shear interface so that you don't have just that tiny keyway holding the hub of your damper onto the snout of the crank. And so what you end up with is, like on the left here, is the pin, a second pin that works in tandem with your keyway to give you more than twice the surface area that's under shear, and thereby making it much, much less likely to fail. So let me show you how I actually did that, the jig that I made. It involves two things. You'll need an old damper bolt, and since these are one-time use only, you can just use the old one that you took off your damper. But you will need to drill a couple precision holes in it. And I had a friend of mine do this on a lathe and a mill. I think he used a mill probably to do these holes. But those holes, I had to make two of them, and they need to be centered on the outside diameter of the crank snout. And the outside diameter of the crank snout happens to be the same diameter as the spacer. Well, it needs to be the same diameter as the spacer, because the reason for that is when your hub is installed on the crank, let's see if I can simulate that here with this stuff. When your hub is installed on your crank, it's recessed down inside the hub. And so to drill a hole that's going to be halfway on the hub and halfway on the snout of the crank will be impossible. And that's what this spacer is for, because this spacer has to be exactly as thick as how far the snout of the crank is recessed inside the hub, so that when you put the spacer in here, when this is installed on the engine, you put the spacer in before you've pinned it, and this spacer should come out perfectly flush with the bottom of your hub. And then when you install the bolt that you've put the holes in, when you get that all tightened down, the center of these two holes will be centered exactly on the interface between the spacer that you had made and the hub. And it'll look like this. Oops. It'll look like this. You should look in there and you should see that spacer comes out exactly to the middle of the hole. And then what you do is you get your drill bit. I think this is a 6mm, but you figure out whatever size pin you want to use, get the right size drill bit, and then this bolt, the holes in the bolt act as a drill guide, so it will drill straight into the interface between the crank and the hub. And that's what you end up with, is you end up with something like this, where you've drilled a hole all the way through the spacer and deep enough into the crank snout that when you put the pin in, it's, this is how long your pin is. And you can see from the one that I had on there before, the pin, when I took this apart, the pin stayed in the hub, and I just left it in there because now I can just put this back on and it will all line up because it came apart that way. And so that's how I pinned my crank. Hey, it's me. As I'm sitting here editing this video, I realized that there's a couple things that weren't quite clear, so I want to clarify things before the end of this video. First is the reason for the two holes in the bolt. One hole will be just so you can see through it to see where the keyway was, so that you can make sure to position the pin 180 degrees opposite from it. So that's the reason there's two holes. And then the other thing I want to clarify is that the spacer is a sacrificial thing that you only use while you're drilling the hole. Once you get the hole drilled, you take the bolt out, you take the spacer out, and then you install a hardened steel pin and you install a new crank bolt. You do not install the spacer in the final assembly. That doesn't need to be in there. So hopefully that will clear up a couple items. I suggest you do the same. All right, guys, that's it for now. I will catch up with you in a week or so.